An island no larger than a few city blocks. Behind broken walls, the last soldiers of a once untouchable order wait for ships that will never arrive. Within days, nearly all of them will be dead or in chains. This was not the Templars' defeat at their peak, this was their final, forgotten grave. This is the story history book skip. For nearly 200 years, the world believed the Knights Templar could not fall. They were monks who fought like soldiers and soldiers who prayed like monks, a contradiction that made them terrifying to their enemies and indispensable to their allies. They had guarded pilgrims on the roads to Jerusalem, held fortresses across the Crusader states, and built a financial network so vast that kings borrowed from them the way modern nations borrow from banks. To wear the white mantle with the red cross was to belong to the most feared and most trusted military order in the medieval world. The order had been born out of necessity, founded in the early 12th century by a small group of knights who took vows of poverty and obedience, while dedicating their swords to the protection of Christian pilgrims traveling the dangerous roads of the Holy Land. What began as a handful of men grew, within decades, into an international institution with fortified houses stretching from England to the eastern Mediterranean, its own fleet of ships, and a system of financial instruments so advanced that a traveling pilgrim could deposit money in one country and withdraw the equivalent on the other side of the continent. Popes granted the order sweeping privileges. Kings granted it land. And on the battlefield, Templar knights earned a reputation for discipline and ferocity that few other forces in the medieval world could match. But by the final years of the 13th century, the world that had made the Templars powerful was disappearing beneath their feet. The Crusader states, the fragile Christian territories clinging to the eastern Mediterranean coast, were shrinking year by year under the pressure of a resurgent Muslim power to the south, the Mamluk Sultanate of Egypt and Syria. Where once there had been kingdoms, there were now a handful of cities, and even those were surrounded. The Templars had built their identity on the defense of the Holy Land. If the Holy Land fell, what would they be for? That question, more than any battle, is what set the order on the road to its true ending. And before we reach the final betrayal, the quiet island siege that history forgot, we have to understand the collapse that made it necessary. By 1291, one city stood as the last major stronghold of Christian power in the Levant, Acre, a fortified port on the coast of what is now Israel. It was rich, crowded, and in the eyes of its defenders, defensible. It was not. Sultan al-Ashraf Khalil arrived outside its walls that spring with an army built for siege warfare on an industrial scale, dozens of massive engines capable of hurling stone day and night without pause. Inside the walls, defenders from across the remaining Crusader world, French knights, Cypriot reinforcements, local militia, and the military orders themselves, tried to hold a perimeter that had never been designed to withstand an assault of this magnitude. For weeks, the city held under relentless bombardment. Then, in early May, the outer walls gave way, and the fighting moved into the streets, house by house, alley by alley, with no clear line left between defenders and the civilians trying to survive around them. What followed was chaos of the worst kind. Civilians crowded the harbor, fighting for space on the last ships out, while soldiers tried to hold the line long enough for as many people as possible to escape. Among the last organized points of resistance was the fortified compound belonging to the Knights Templar, one of the few structures in the city still capable of offering shelter and defense as the rest of Acre burned around it. The Templar Grand Master Guillaume de Beaujeu was struck down leading the defense, mortally wounded in the final desperate fighting near the city's edge. Command fell to others, and for a short time the Templar compound became a last refuge for those unable to reach the ships. When it too finally fell days later, the symbolic message was unmistakable. Acre had been the beating heart of what remained of the Crusader mainland. Its loss meant the end of 2 centuries of Christian territorial presence in the Holy Land. Acre was gone, but a handful of Templars refused to accept that the story was over. Before we follow them to the island where that refusal would be tested, it's worth pausing to meet the figures whose decisions, years later, would matter even more than any battle. In Cyprus, where the surviving Templars regrouped after Acre, a knight named Jacques de Molay was rising through the ranks of the order. He was not yet a household name. He was a capable, conservative commander, a man shaped by decades of frontier warfare, soon to become Grand Master and to carry the full weight of what the Templars would become in the public imagination. Far away in Paris, a young king named Philip IV sat on the French throne, a monarch whose reign would become defined by an unrelenting hunger for money and centralized royal power. Philip had fought expensive wars against England and Flanders, and those wars had left the French crown deeply in debt, in part to the Templars themselves, who by then operated something close to an international banking system out of their fortified houses across Europe. And in Rome, or rather not quite in Rome, sat Pope Clement V, a French-born pontiff whose papacy would be based not in Italy but in southern France, a pope whose independence from the French crown was, in practice, extremely limited. None of these 3 men had yet decided the Templars' fate. That decision was still years away. But first, in the eastern Mediterranean, the order tried one final time to hold a piece of the Holy Land in its hands, on an island almost nobody remembers today. After Acre, the surviving Templars withdrew to the island of Cyprus, which had served as a rear base for the Crusader states for decades. They were battered but far from finished. The order retained enormous wealth, a functioning fleet, and thousands of members scattered across Europe and the Mediterranean. What they no longer had was a foothold on the mainland they had sworn to defend. Out of that loss came a plan, ambitious and in hindsight almost desperate, to establish a new base not on the mainland itself, but on a small island just off the Syrian coast near the city of Tortosa. The island was called Ruad, known today as Ruad, barely visible on most maps of the era, but strategically positioned as a potential staging ground for any future attempt to reclaim territory in the Holy Land. The logic was simple. If the Templars could not hold the mainland, they could at least hold a piece of water close enough to it to matter, a symbolic and literal anchor point, a promise that the crusading project was paused rather than finished. It was meant to be a beachhead for renewal. Instead, it became a trap. Around the year 1300, the Templars fortified Ruad, garrisoning it with knights and allied troops, including Christian soldiers from Cyprus and Cilician Armenia who joined the effort. For a time, there was genuine cause for optimism. Templar forces conducted raids along the nearby coast, and word arrived of a potential ally on a scale the order could never have matched alone. The Mongol Ilkhanate under its ruler Ghazan Khan was pushing into Mamluk-held Syria from the east. A coordinated assault, Mongol force from the mainland, Christian force from the sea, might have reopened the door the Crusaders thought had closed forever. For a brief window, it seemed possible. Then the window closed. Ghazan's campaign stalled and the Mongol army withdrew from Syria before any real coordination with the Templars could occur. The garrison on Ruad, which had staked its strategy on outside support arriving in time, found itself alone. Supply runs from Cyprus grew less reliable. Across the water, Mamluk forces began gathering on the Syrian coast, watching the small island with open intent. The reinforcements the Templars were counting on never came. What did come in the autumn of 1302 was a fleet. The Mamluk assault on Ruad was not the stuff of legend. There was no dramatic charge, no single day of glory. It was a siege in the oldest and cruelest sense, a stronger force surrounding a weaker one and simply waiting, tightening, until the outcome became inevitable. Cut off from Cyprus, the garrison's food and fresh water ran low. The fortifications on Ruad, while defensible against raids, were never built to withstand a prolonged, determined siege backed by a full invasion fleet. From the walls, the defenders could see the mainland they had once hoped to reclaim, close enough to make out the coastline, far enough to be entirely unreachable. Day by day, the defenders' position worsened, and there was no realistic path of retreat, no reinforcing army marching to their relief. They were, in the truest sense, alone on a rock in the sea, watching an empty horizon for sails that belonged to no one but their enemy. Eventually, facing starvation and overwhelming numbers, the garrison's commanders negotiated terms of surrender. This is the point in the story where popular retellings usually stop, or skip past quickly, because what happened next does not fit the image of chivalrous medieval warfare that most documentaries prefer to show. According to the surviving historical accounts, the terms of surrender were not honored in full. While some Templar knights were taken as prisoners of value, useful for ransom or exchange, the local Christian allied troops who had fought and bled alongside them, the Syrian and Armenian soldiers who had no European ransom value attached to their names, were treated far more harshly. Sources describe them being killed or enslaved despite the surrender agreement, a betrayal that fell hardest on the men, least likely to be remembered by history at all. This is the brutal truth history often admits only in passing. The last stand of the Templars in the Holy Land was not a heroic final battle worthy of ballads. It was a slow, isolated strangulation, ending not in glorious death but in broken promises and the quiet disappearance of soldiers whose names were never carefully recorded in the first place. With Ruad gone, the Templars no longer held a single foot of territory anywhere in the Holy Land. And for their enemies back in Europe, that made them vulnerable in a very different way. Before we follow the order into its final political destruction, it's worth pausing to correct two persistent myths. The first myth is that the Templars were destroyed in one dramatic final battle, a last stand in the cinematic sense, swords raised against overwhelming odds. The reality is closer to what happened on Ruad: isolation, broken supply lines, a failed alliance, and a betrayal of surrender terms that left allied troops to suffer the worst consequences while the story quietly faded from memory. The second myth is that the destruction of the Templar Order was primarily a religious matter, a church rooting out heresy within its own ranks. The reality is far more political than pious. King Philip IV of France owed the Templars significant debts from his wars, and the order's independence, wealth, and cross-border reach made it both a financial obstacle and an irresistible target. Religious accusations would serve as the mechanism. Royal debt and royal ambition were the true engine underneath. The Templars had survived the loss of the Holy Land. They would not survive what came next, and this time the threat would not come from a Muslim army across the sea, but from a Christian king across the negotiating table. In the years following the loss of Ruad, the Templars retreated fully to Cyprus and to their properties across Europe. Their original purpose, the armed defense of Christian territory in the Holy Land, no longer had a physical territory left to defend. That left the order in an uncomfortable position, enormously wealthy, heavily armed, answerable to the Pope rather than to any single king, and increasingly without an obvious mission. For Philip IV, that combination was intolerable. He was already deeply indebted to the order, having relied on Templar treasuries to help fund his costly wars, and French royal finances were under serious strain. An organization that held vast property, operated its own courts, and could not be taxed or controlled by the crown was, from Philip's perspective, both an insult to his authority and an opportunity waiting to be seized. Accusations began to circulate quietly at first. Whispers of heresy, of blasphemous initiation rituals, of secret practices unbecoming of men sworn to holy vows. Historians today largely regard these accusations as fabricated or wildly exaggerated, manufactured to provide legal and religious cover for what was, underneath, a financial seizure. Pope Clement V, based in France and deeply dependent on Philip's goodwill, was in no position to meaningfully resist the pressure building around him. On a single coordinated morning, the accusations stopped being whispers and became arrests. On October 13, 1307, agents acting on Philip IV's direct orders carried out a simultaneous pre-dawn sweep across France, arresting Templar knights in their houses and preceptories before most of them fully understood what was happening. The operation was meticulously planned in secret, coordinated to strike everywhere at once so that no warning could spread and no meaningful resistance could be organized. Grand Master Jacques de Molay was among the hundreds taken into custody that single morning, along with the bulk of the order's leadership in France. Sealed royal instructions had been distributed weeks in advance to officials across the kingdom, opened only on the appointed date, ensuring that arrests in distant provinces happened within hours of those in Paris itself. Templar properties were seized alongside the men who occupied them, their records confiscated, their assets placed under royal control before any formal charge had even been read aloud. For an institution that had projected untouchable strength for nearly 2 centuries, the speed and completeness of the collapse stunned observers across Europe. An order that had guarded kings, financed crusades, and stood as one of the most respected military forces in Christendom had been dismantled in a matter of hours, not by an enemy army, but by the stroke of a royal command. What followed the arrests was not a trial in any fair sense of the word. Imprisoned and isolated from one another, Templar knights were subjected to interrogation methods designed less to uncover truth than to produce the confessions royal officials had already decided to obtain. Under sustained physical torture, many Templars, including Jacques de Molay himself, confessed to charges that ranged from denying Christ to engaging in blasphemous rituals during initiation. De Molay's confession would later be retracted, and he was far from alone. Scores of knights across France recanted statements extracted under duress once removed from immediate torture, describing forced admissions given only to end unbearable pain, not because the accusations held any truth. Some Templars did not survive their imprisonment long enough to recant at all, dying in custody before any formal judgment was reached. But the damage to the order's reputation and to the political case Philip needed had already been done. Confessions, however coerced, carried enormous weight in the court of public and papal opinion, and once enough names were attached to enough signed statements, the truth of any individual case became almost irrelevant to the outcome. Pope Clement V, caught between his formal authority over the order and the unrelenting pressure of the French crown, ultimately moved to dissolve the Templars altogether. At the Council of Vienne in 1312, the order was formally suppressed, its property in most regions transferred to the rival Knights Hospitaller rather than seized outright by secular rulers, though in France a considerable portion of that wealth passed through royal hands before it ever reached its intended destination. For most Templars, imprisonment, forced confession, and the dissolution of their order marked the end of the story. For their Grand Master, an even darker moment was still to come. Jacques de Molay spent years in captivity following his initial confession, and as the final judgment against him approached in 1314, he made a decision that would define how history remembers him. Standing before a crowd in Paris alongside fellow Templar Geoffrey de Charny, de Molay publicly retracted his earlier confession, declaring the charges against the order false and the admissions extracted under torture worthless. It was an act of defiance that sealed his fate. Furious at the public reversal, Philip IV ordered both men burned at the stake that same day on an island in the Seine without further trial. De Molay died as he had lived for those final years, a prisoner of a king who had never needed real evidence, only the appearance of it. Legend holds that as the flames rose, de Molay cursed both Philip IV and Pope Clement V, summoning them to face divine judgment within the year. Both men did, in fact, die within 12 months of the execution, a coincidence that fed the legend for centuries afterward. Reputable historians treat this story as exactly that, a legend, almost certainly added after the fact to give a brutal execution a dramatic, symmetrical ending. It should be presented as folklore, not as confirmed history, but it is worth understanding why the story took hold so powerfully. People needed the ending to mean something. The order was gone, but its ending raised questions that still haven't fully settled. Much of what popular culture believes about the Templars' downfall involves treasure, vanished gold, secret vaults spirited away in the night before the arrests. The historical reality is less mysterious and considerably more bureaucratic. Templar assets across most of Europe were formally transferred to the Knights Hospitaller, the order's longtime rival and counterpart under papal decree. In France, a significant share of that wealth was absorbed by the crown itself before ever reaching Hospitaller hands, a far more mundane explanation than any hidden fortune, but one that fits Philip IV's motives perfectly. Individual former Templars did not simply vanish either. Many were absorbed into other religious or military orders, some quietly returned to private life, and the harsh punishments handed down to the order's leadership were not universally applied to every rank-and-file member across Europe. And then there is Ruad itself, the detail most consistently left out of popular tellings of this story. The betrayal of the local Christian allied troops, men who fought and in many cases died or were enslaved despite negotiated terms of surrender, rarely receives more than a passing mention if it receives one at all. Their names were not carefully preserved. Their sacrifice does not fit neatly into the story of European knights and French kings. But without them, the last military stand of the Crusader era in the Holy Land does not happen at all. In the centuries after the order's suppression, its reputation was reshaped again and again by legend rather than fact. Absorbed into Freemasonic mythology, treasure-hunting folklore and secret society fiction that has little connection to the actual, grinding, bureaucratic, and often brutal history of how the Templars actually ended. Strip away the legends, and what's left is a harder, more human story. It is easy from a distance of 7 centuries to see the Templars as symbols: crusading zeal, medieval banking power, secretive ritual, royal betrayal. It is harder and more important to see them as the men they actually were, soldiers and monks caught between empires and the political interests of kings who saw them as either tools or threats. The garrison stranded on Ruad, watching the horizon for ships that never came, mirrors almost exactly the isolation of the imprisoned knights years later in France, waiting in cells for a trial that was never designed to be fair. Both groups were abandoned, first by strategy and circumstance, then by the very institutions, church and crown, they had spent their lives serving. 200 years of accumulated power and prestige did not end in a single dramatic collapse. It ended twice in 2 different forms of the same abandonment, once on a forgotten island and once in the prisons and execution grounds of France. 2 centuries of power ended not in glory, but in isolation and ash. The dismantling of the Knights Templar left a mark on European history far beyond the order itself. It established a dangerous and lasting precedent that a sufficiently determined monarch, working alongside a sufficiently pliant church, could dismantle even the most powerful religious military institution in Christendom, seize its wealth, and rewrite the public understanding of its purpose in the process. Future kings took note. At the same time, the order's mysterious and violent end proved to be extraordinarily fertile ground for myth-making. Over the following centuries, the Templars were reimagined as guardians of secret treasures, founders of Freemasonry, and keepers of hidden knowledge, a mythology that has often overshadowed the far more grounded, and in many ways far more tragic historical reality of debt, politics, torture, and betrayal. The suppression of the Templars also reshaped the balance of power among Europe's remaining military orders. The Knights Hospitaller, who absorbed much of the Templars' former property, went on to relocate their own base of operations first to Rhodes and later to Malta, carrying forward a version of the crusading military tradition long after the Templars themselves had ceased to exist. In that sense, the order's end was not simply an ending, but a transfer, one institution's downfall becoming another institution's inheritance, quietly folded into the broader story of medieval Europe rather than standing apart from it. And Ruad itself deserves a place in that history it rarely receives. As the final organized military engagement of the Crusader era in the Levant, it marks the true closing chapter of 2 centuries of Christian military presence in the Holy Land, not with the fall of Acre in 1291, as most accounts suggest, but a full decade later, on a small island most people have never heard of. History remembers the fire in Paris, it forgets the island that fell first. Return for a moment to that small island off the Syrian coast, the walls broken, the garrison waiting for ships that would never come. That was not a footnote. That was the true final stand of the Knights Templar in the Holy Land they had sworn to defend, a slow, brutal ending swallowed by isolation and betrayal, years before Philip IV ever gave the order to arrest a single knight in France. The fall of the Templars was never one event. It was two, an island abandoned by allies who never arrived, and an order abandoned by the king and church it had faithfully served, each ending in its own quiet, brutal way, each largely written out of the story that history chose to remember.